The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. All right, this is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought, mishandling his control board again. Anyway, this is we have a special community radio exclusive conversation to share with you tonight. Before we get on with our scheduled topic, our Washington correspondent was made aware of an unscheduled, unpublicized, and private meeting between President-elect Donald Trump and the president of the Steelworkers Union 1999, who represents the workers at the Carrier plant in Indiana, where Mr. Trump made his speech claiming to be saving lots of jobs. And you may recall that last week there was a public tiff between the two of them when Chuck Jones, the president of the union, was on television and claiming that Mr. Trump lied. And as I said, our Washington correspondent found out about this unscheduled, unpublicized meeting and got a chance to go in and sit in on it and record it. So let's hear what transpired between these two men.
Mr. Trump, you lied like a dog to my workers.
Oh, yeah? Well, you're a stupid head.
Mr. Trump, all you have to do is acknowledge you made a mistake and this will all go away.
You're a bad man. I hate you. I hate you.
You're acting like a little sissy, you know that?
I am not a sissy. I'm not a sissy.
Well, that was embarrassing. Anyway, moving right along. Okay, with our scheduled topic tonight, Lang Baker is here to assist me. How you doing, Lang? Thanks for coming.
Glad to be here, Wayne.
And by the way, you can call in 343-9927, 343-9927. Lang and I are going to discuss prostitution and whether or not we should legalize it, and if we do legalize it, how should it be regulated? And I guess I'll kick things off just to get started, Lang. Of course, prostitution has been called the world's oldest profession, probably since people have been able to speak.
Since there have been professions, I guess.
Yeah, really. Well, yes, and ways to communicate it. And I noticed, too, doing this research for this show, that it may be older than even human beings realize, because there have been studies that have demonstrated, and studies by reputable organizations published by organizations like the National Geographic and BBC News, that showed that male chimpanzees trade food for sex with their female partners. And of course,
astounding.
Yeah, imagine that, but it's the ultimate instinct, I guess. It's the most powerful drive of all living creatures, probably, not just humans, not just mammals or vertebrates or whatever. It's just there. It's so important. So you got to expect that. I mean, and of course, sharing sex or food for sex, on the male's part in chimpanzees, assures the survival of those females anyway. And as I understand it, they don't normally hunt food. The males do. They don't hunt meat. But they need it. It's beneficial, and so they benefit from the males with this voluntary exchange. But I also looked into the history of prostitution, and frankly, Lang, prostitution started out as a not very good deal for women, from what I can tell. The 5th century BC, there was sacred prostitution in the Middle East, Samaria and the like. This was where women had sex with men who were not their spouse for religious reasons, whatever those might have been. But in ancient Babylon, each woman was required by religious law to make it to the sanctuary of Melita. I think it was, I wouldn't know how it was pronounced, that's how it's spelled. And would be required at least once to have sex with a foreigner as a sign of hospitality. And, I don't imagine they had any choice of that. Well, it says that they were required to at least once in their lifetime make it to this place and have sex with a stranger, from a foreign country. And then in 100 BC, there were Yingxis in China who were actually the Emperor Wu would bring them around with his armies as they traveled around the country to provide comfort and the like to his warriors. And that made me think of the Civil War general. I think he was Union, but it was Hooker was his last name, and he was the one that was, in American history, he was the one known for bringing along wagon loads or train car loads of
hookers.
Prostitutes for his troops. And then, of course, in ancient Greece, both women and boys, mostly adolescent boys, I believe, were involved in prostitution. And some were slaves, but other adolescent boys did it voluntarily and made good money, and of course the women there. And I think we all know that throughout history, many women have prospered where it was legal and accepted, as prostitutes. There were, notable historical figures throughout history, I guess, that were just basically prostitutes that made a lot of money.
Interesting.
But anyway, in America, it's, for the most part, illegal. We try to prohibit it for all kinds of, I guess, moralistic reasons. They try to justify things. What have you found on that, Lang, as far as what the benefits are, what the reasons are?
One place I ran across indicated that the rise for passing laws prohibiting prostitution only came like in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It wasn't a criminal issue in the earlier days of the nation. It was relatively later that it swept the nation, the passing of these laws.
Yeah, in fact, this one article I read, A Brief History of Prostitution in the U.S. from the Honest Courtesan, which is a blog, stated that in pre-industrial times, sex work was one of the few ways a woman could make a good living for herself. And it was estimated that in the 19th century, like you're saying, like 5.5% of the female population was engaged in the practice.
So that's a significant proportion. And if you had figures on what percent of the female population was engaged in any kind of work,
good point. Yeah,
it would probably be an even more remarkable percentage.
And that's more
of the total female labor force that was engaged in.
That was probably one of the reasons
profession.
why. Yeah, and it's probably one of the reasons why the whole thing started, at least in Western culture, because women were forbidden to work or do much of anything.
Yeah, I think the practice of supplying women for the comfort of troops is much more widespread than the two examples that you mentioned.
Right,
and Hooker and the Chinese.
Yeah, well, the Japanese in World War II, I guess, in Korea, the big flap over that, where they enslaved local
there was
women.
Enslavement, yeah, and there needs to be a distinction drawn between voluntary engagement in this profession versus trafficking that's common today, and enslavement, as you were referring to with the Japanese in Korea.
Yeah, well, and the boys in ancient Greece, the slave boys and things like that. But yeah, but I guess what I'm wondering is would legalizing it end those things?
Would legalizing
prostitution
enslavement?
Well, put an end to any enslavement for sex or the sex trafficking.
Well, I don't think that it would put an end to it. I mean, there's enslavement for other purposes. There are farm laborers who are enslaved, and the fact that people can legally hire themselves to harvest crops hasn't ended the practice of slave labor in that area. So, I think there's two independent issues.
What about the argument that it commoditizes a woman's humanity or her sexuality? I've seen that as an argument against legalization. But for me, it's like that's kind of an abstract argument. Number one, and number two, isn't that up to the woman? If it truly is a voluntary activity for her.
I think that's the issue, whether it's truly voluntary. And commoditization is what runs contemporary capitalist economy.
It runs nature.
Commoditization of all things.
Looking at the chimpanzees, it's commoditized there in the the lower animals, so to speak.
Well, I think of commoditization is more in the nature of how the product is presented and how consumption of it is promoted.
Okay. So, yeah, a woman, if it's a commodity, then it's not necessarily something that the woman needs for survival. That's what she chooses to sell and make money at. Is that what, I mean, maybe I don't understand what commodities are, but...
Well, our vocabulary is slippery. Commodity means, whatever the context dictates it to mean. But I was thinking that your question was referring to whether it dehumanizes by turning it into a mere commodity as opposed to
right.
A voluntary transaction that a person enters into with full awareness and consent, an adult.
Right, and yeah. But, and again, that argument I think has some validity in some cases, but I've known of high-end call girls, they were called, that made lots of money and were quite happy and had high self-esteem and everything else, and it didn't seem to harm them.
That has been the basis for some criticism of some of the surveys that have been done that come up with conclusions about the life conditions of women who are in prostitution and how they are abused. And it's like the criticism of those surveys is that the participants in the surveys are the ones who are working on the street and
the most
exploited by
ones.
pimps
Yes.
and thrown into jail and drug abuse centers and things like this. And that's a small
It's a very
proportion
small,
of the total
yes.
participants in the prostitution business.
Yeah, and those women usually are there because they're economically incapable, of doing anything else, or they have drug problems or substance abuse problems.
It's a complex constellation
Yeah.
of personality and psychological and social problems that
Yeah, I want
are
to
contributing
mention.
that situation.
I want to mention a study of published by the Reader's Digest years ago when I still read the magazine. I don't read it anymore. Anyway, but I want to remind the listeners this is a pause for thought. We have Lang Baker and me, Wayne Parker, the host. This is a live call-in show. You're welcome to call in and share your thoughts and comments on prostitution, whether or not we should legalize it. 343-9927, 343-9927. And yeah, years ago when I was a libertarian zealot, Lang, I read this study published in the Reader's Digest that it was totally one-sided, totally against legalization, claiming that prostitution is dangerous for the women because they get beaten up or they're abused by their pimps, like you were saying. And it's dangerous for the Johns because they get beaten up and robbed often and things like that. Then there, of course, is venereal disease and all kinds of stuff. And even, of course, I was a right-wing zealot at the time, but still, I could see then that the whole reason those things were happening with prostitution is because it was illegal, and I remember they did a sting in Gulfport, Mississippi when I was living there years ago, and one of the girls they scooped up off the street said, she was in tears because, she needed her fix. But she was saying how she's going to be out on the street doing it as soon as she's released anyway. Why are they even wasting this time, And that was a shame. But that is only a small part of it. Back in this country, I don't know if they had the technology to prevent venereal diseases back then, but I know when this country had legal brothels, at least it was safe for the girls and the Johns. They had clean environments where the head of the organization made sure the women were fit and fed and had decent clothes, I guess, and guys that became violent or belligerent were kicked out.
Right.
So I wonder what the advantage would be to making it illegal. It's kind of like what we've done with drugs in America.
Well, there are a number of countries that have changed their laws. Western countries, New Zealand, is one, in the reports there are that now there's not a fear of reporting any abuse. It's like kind of similar to the problem with illegal immigrants being afraid to come to the police to report crimes perpetrated against them.
Right.
And so if it's not a crime, if it's not criminalized itself, then the victims of those assaults can safely come forward and report. Whereas when under the attitude that it's a crime and immoral, there's reports of, if they come forward, well, the attitude towards them is, well, what do you expect? That's what you're asking for,
right?
You know, as opposed to taking criminal reports seriously.
Yeah, and indeed, that is what is often said is the attitude of police many times with the street workers, the girls that are on the street, because it's like they're insignificant human beings. You know, that in itself is probably more dehumanizing than being a street, worker. But yeah, they often are treated as something as lesser beings and all that, and it's considered they get what they deserve. But again, yeah, go ahead, Lang.
I was going to say, in Sweden they've taken a different approach. Prostitution is not a crime, but it's still a crime to pay for sex. So the Johns are criminals, but the prostitutes are not. And so that's kind of flipped the tables there as to who is viewed as the responsible party for the conduct that society wants to prohibit in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess the upside of that would be, at least the men are getting, persecuted almost equally, but, at least to some extent, which is, it's not a totally one-sided thing against the women. But you're listening to A Pause for Thought with Wayne Parker and Lang Baker. We're discussing prostitution, pros and cons of legalizing it. And Lang, you mentioned cultural things, or cultural taboos, and how obviously other countries take a different view of prostitution.
There have been movements to change the laws that have been successful in some other countries, and there's been a movement active in recent years here in the United States to change the laws.
But, the argument I've heard recently against legalizing prostitution is that if we legalize it, more people engage in it.
Well, some studies have shown in some of the countries where it's been legalized is actually the number of prostitutes has gone down.
Number of prostitutes.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Did they speculate any reasons why?
Not in the brief excerpt that I ran across.
Okay.
This was an interesting website called procon.org that on a wide variety of public policy issues, they have quotes from people on both sides of the issue. And in this particular page on prostitution, they've got representatives of various government agencies here and around the world, and advocacy organizations, like the ACLU's position that it should be decriminalized.
Now, National Organization for Women, their official policy is to legalize prostitution also.
Yeah.
Precisely because it will reduce, at least, trafficking and abuse of women and things like that. And they claim that it's the woman's inherent right. It's her body. She should be able to do what she wishes with it. And I would favor a regulated type industry, that sort of thing, just to make sure it's fairly safe. But, as much as we can make anything safe in our lives, but...
That's what is advocated largely from what I've run across.
Well, when I was in the Navy, I was stationed on the West Coast, so we made it out to the Pacific and West Pacific a lot. And the Philippines, Subic Bay, was a frequent stop for us. Anyway, but there was a Longapo City right outside the base, and that was a thriving community of pretty much barbershops, bars, restaurants, and there were prostitutes in every establishment, everywhere. And I was told when I first got there that in the beginning, in the early years, there was no regulation, and the venereal disease rates were just skyrocketing among American sailors. And the Navy saw this as a serious problem, so they stepped in, and the Navy was regulating, or some government entity was regulating the prostitution industry outside of all the military bases in the Philippines. And the girls had to have cards on them. They had to get, there was a record kept of their regular medical checkups, and if they were found to have some kind of sexually transmitted disease, they were taken out of circulation until it was cured. The downside of that is if they were discovered to have one that was not curable, the country being what it was, and their views of women, they were just kicked out the door. And we were instructed by our commands that if we were to partake in this industry, to not get with any of the girls that were on the streets, because if they were on the street, that meant they weren't allowed to operate in a bar, which meant they had something wrong that you don't want to mess with. And then the last time I was back there, I'd made 3 trips over into the Pacific. And the last time I was there, we were told it was no longer being regulated by the Navy. I wonder if this was after Marcos had declared he was going to kick us out, or maybe it was the woman that replaced him declared they were going to kick us out, the military out of there, and which they did. But the Navy had left and just given up on regulating the prostitution industry, and once again, venereal disease was rising. There were a lot of guys that were getting having problems with it. So to me, that shows that regulating it and legalizing it does make it safer, in that regard.
Yeah, there's some hard data that backs that up from what your experience was there.
I can imagine, yeah. But it just makes sense to me. And then, like you said, even you were mentioning before about women that get beat up as working girls. If it's illegal, they're afraid to go to the police for the same reason drug addicts are afraid to go get help. But it would apply to guys or people with venereal diseases. I mean, if they got it through prostitution, they may not want to come forward and talk about it.
At least not report the source.
Right, or report the source, yeah.
So it can't be backtracked to cure other people
to cure
who've
the
been
problem,
exposed.
right? That's true. That I didn't think about that. That's a more complete look into it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Interesting little piece I ran across on that website I mentioned from a Time magazine article back in 1936, talking about the situation in Phoenix, Arizona. And according to this article, the practice of prostitution has been technically licensed by the Phoenix police for a period of many years. The women from the red light district are arraigned before the magistrate's court once a month and invariably plead guilty. Those charged with being inmates of a house of prostitution pay a fine of $25. Those charged with operating a house of prostitution pay $50. The city derives a revenue from this source of approximately $20,000 a year. The advantages of the existing system are that practically all prostitutes are known to the police and can be kept under supervision. The city derives a substantial revenue, and prostitution is kept out of the residential districts.
How about that?
And it's 80 years ago.
Oh, really? 80
in Phoenix, Arizona, 1936.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if they'd been honest, they would have just legalized it instead of going through the hassle for everybody and hauling the women in and charging them and fining them and whatnot. Just, come by once a month or have them send in their tax check once a month or whatever.
Right.
And that would give you authority to come in and, make sure they were changing the sheets regularly and stuff like that, offering condoms and the like. But you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker on A Pause for Thought. Feel free to call in. We're discussing prostitution, the pros and cons of legalizing it. And if we do legalize it, how should it be regulated? Feel free to call in, 343-9927, 343-9927. Lang, you were mentioning before about cultural norms and how in America, and I read this too, in the United States up until the late 19th century, it was universally accepted. I mean, all the states, the most laws, and I have something here, this is from Maggie McNeil's on the Honest Courtesan, A Brief History of Prostitution in the U.S. She writes here, the governor's attitude, prostitution was accepted as a fact of life even by those who disapproved of it, and the majority of American laws on the subject were municipal ordinances dealing with where, when, and how a professional might ply her trade. So there's an example right there that in early America.
Yeah, so those were the laws back then, and it perfectly parallels the practice in Phoenix, Arizona in 1936.
Yeah.
It's just,
I'm thinking of the show from back in the 70s, Here Come the Brides. I don't know if you recall that or not.
I don't.
It was a popular show that I watched as a kid, but it was about Seattle, Washington at the turn of the century, or late 19th century anyway. And they would say in the opening of the show every week or whenever it was that there were a bunch of men in Seattle and there was a great shortage of women, and so it was basically a sitcom of all these women that were shipped in, to be wives. And of course they called it wives and brides and stuff like that, but I'm like, dude, now that I'm older, it's like, oh yeah, right, but I wonder what the real history was over there about that.
yeah.
But yeah, I just wonder, just the same thing with the drug war. Making it illegal doesn't make it go away.
It drives it into the underground and
It makes it more dangerous for everybody.
more dangerous for everyone involved. Yeah.
And one of the arguments I saw, and it was by an American organization, arguments against legalizing it is because it threatens the institution of marriage. In fact, that argument was made to me today, and the person was wondering if we legalize it, would people who would not do that because it was illegal then end up doing it? And my idea on that is that if you're cheating on your wife, it doesn't really matter if you're doing it with a legal or an illegal prostitute. It's but
Right. That's one point that some of the arguments in favor of legalizing prostitution have made is why is it illegal if money changes hands, but it's not illegal
if you just buy them dinner or something.
Yeah.
Whoops, yeah, right. Not that I'd ever expect anything from a meal, but anyhow, that's the case. There are other ways of paying that aren't money.
Right. It's like there's a kind of contradiction there with the commitment to free market and free enterprise on the one hand, and then this kind of prohibition of personal freedom.
Yes, and I'm thinking
on
of
the other.
Yeah, sin taxes or sin laws, that kind of thing, and but I wanted to get on to the cultural things though. I had a coworker years ago who was from Eritrea in northern Africa, and we got to talking one night when I was working in his area, and he said, Wayne, in my mother country, Eritrea, it's assumed when you go into a restaurant and there are waitresses, like there always are in restaurants, I guess, it's assumed that the waitresses are prostitutes. And he told me, he said it's entirely accepted there in their culture. He said even married women who don't like the obligation of having sex or whatever are perfectly fine with their husbands going with a prostitute because it's no big deal to them. It doesn't show that he's being disloyal or anything. He's getting something that he needs or desires that they either can't or don't want to give them, and if that's what it takes to keep him happy, they're good with it. They don't seem to care. It's totally accepted in the culture.
Yeah, the reflection of cultural variations. I mean, you can also look at the difference in the cultural attitude towards the family and wives, and the difference between polygamous societies and monogamous societies. Multiple wives are acceptable in certain cultures.
Yes, and as Miss Carla here at the station tonight was telling me earlier, the polygamy and other multiple partner relationships is something that is totally accepted by a lot of women too. So it's not that big of a deal, except maybe for insecure people or whatever. I don't know, but
well, there's a cultural difference. What people grow up around and is accepted as normal in their society, and then there's societies that profess greater freedom of individual choices, and then it becomes a conflict within the society because of the differing attitudes over what's acceptable and what's not.
Right, and I guess I appreciate the arguments of the people that don't accept prostitution. However, I always fall back on the practical aspect of it. That making it illegal doesn't make it go away. It just makes it more dangerous. But we got to go, Lang. I appreciate you contributing to the show here. You've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker on A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. We thank you for listening and have a nice evening.